Welcome to 1850 Main Street, a place where friends get together and talk about their country and hope for a brighter future. Your hosts have built this spot over the past 40 years, meeting every day with people who are in the headlines and behind the real stories.
David Zanotti and Rob Walgate are at the table today with a question prompted by Dave's recent visit to Washington, D.C. Should Americans be more concerned about a civil war or a revolution?
Well, Dave, you just returned from a trip to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, what a great big adventure. I hadn't been there for a while.
I told you, you should have always rolled the camera. What an amazing YouTube channel that would have been. Dave Does Washington. Can you imagine the views that we would have gotten for some of the places you were able to go and some of the things you could see, and to see some of your reactions firsthand, to see the growth of government at your fingertips?
You know, that is one of the things that always frightens me. Over the years, we've had the privilege to go to Washington a lot of times, over 45 years. And I can tell you, you used to be able to fly into Reagan National. As you're coming out of Reagan National and you start to look toward the district, toward the city, you could see the Capitol building. Now you can see about a third of the top of the Capitol because of all the structures that have been built between Reagan Airport and the Capitol. And as soon as you pull out of Reagan, you start to see the names on the buildings of the major corporations and the unions and the lobbying firms on these great big skyscrapers. Now, they're not like 30 or 40 story skyscrapers, but they're significant. And they view the Capitol, of course, as the highest piece of ground in the district. And it was always supposed to be that the People's House, the Capitol building, would be the higher than everything else, because it's a statement being made about our form of government. We the people, a constitutional Republican form of government. Okay. Well, it's being eclipsed by all the people who are pursuing the money that gets spent under that dome. And that's the feeling that you get in Washington, D.C. More today than ever before, more than in the 90s when we went in the midst of all of the corruption with the House banking scandal and the House post office scandal and all of those things that people knew something was wrong inside the Capitol. Today, it's so much worse. It is so much worse.
And do you feel those tentacles go out, though? I mean, when you look at the voting patterns of what's happened in Northern Virginia through the years, the government employment, it seems that has been an empowerment and a deciding factor on how many of those folks vote in federal elections, even state elections.
There's no question that Virginia has become a blue state, a Democrat state, a liberal progressive state, because of all the people who make a living from Washington, D.C., who live in Virginia. Now, that's kind of like an interesting thread. Let's take the thread to the bigger tapestry, to the bigger picture. What we have today is a situation. We were talking about our visit with Dr. Allen while I was in D.C. He received the prestigious Bradley Prize, which is given to people who are noted for their leadership in America. And it's an annual prize, and he was one of the 2024 recipients, one of three. We had the privilege to go and be a part of that event and to observe him receiving that award and to spend time with some of his colleagues. It was a wonderful experience. That part of the visit to Washington, D.C. was wonderful. And we've actually put that up on the public square where you can hear his remarks at the Bradley event and ours as well. So it was an interesting event, but it was almost a stark contrast in actual reality, because as we've continued our conversations with Dr. Allen over the years about what's really happening in our country, and he takes the long view. You know, he starts with Plato and comes forward, and has for his entire life. He's been a student in this field for well over 60 years. And one of the most accomplished authors that we've ever met in this field, and lecturers and professors. He's traveled all over the place in teaching with major universities, and the former chairman of the Civil Rights Commission and dean at Michigan State University. The credibility of William B. Allen is unshakable, as the award that he just received attests. But in talking about this, we've been talking about the whole idea that people are talking about a civil war. Civil war is coming. Civil war is coming. Of course, he thinks that'd be a disaster. We do too. There's nothing to be gained there. That would be the height of foolishness. But he said we're missing the mark It's not a civil war. It's a revolution. I thought, oh, okay, so that's kind of where the Tea Party was coming from, right? They're going to have a revolution. He said, no. He said the direction is different. And of course, I'm always saying to Dr. Allen, please tell me more. And he said, this is a revolution of the top. This is a revolution of the administrative state, of the people that run and control our government. And it's a revolution against the founding. Not to restore the founding, but to eliminate it, to reconstruct America. So they call it transform America into a centralized administrative state. In the old days, we used to use the word bureaucracy a lot, the federal bureaucracy. Well, in reality, it's the federal administrative state. And that is all of these agencies that occupy all of these buildings across the entire district and for miles and miles from there, that control our lives, that feed off of our tax dollars and of corporate tax dollars. They're all tax funded, they're all tax supported, and they basically seek to control transportation, energy, healthcare, business practices, labor practices, interest rates. It goes on and on. The federal administrative state, people whose names you will never know, agencies you'll never see, alphabet soup led by people who are not elected by anyone, operating off of a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress and handed over to a federal agency that then took that particular piece and maybe they were given a horse and buggy and they turned it into a rocket ship through federal regulations that the administrative state creates. Not all laws are created by Congress. There's the United States Code, which is created by Congress, and then there's the administrative code, which is created by the administrative state, by the agencies. And Congress doesn't vote on those laws. Once Congress gives the authority to an agency to handle something, like HHS handling Obamacare, then HHS controls Obamacare, and Congress never catches up with them again. So that HHS can be doing 90% of the stuff that Congress said would never happen in Obamacare, and nobody can stop them.
And the checkbook's unlimited in the process.
Exactly. The checkbook is unlimited, and all we end up doing is creating more and more and more debt.
And that's what you see is when there's no checks and balances in the system and in the process, and you see the growth of government and how much it's expanded over the last couple of generations. It leaves, I mean, when you look at the departments, I mean, you talked about the buildings down there. I mean, just look at the federal departments and how far their tentacles go into each and every state.
Rob, this is the challenge that we've watched. Basically, we've watched our country collapse over the last 50 years into the arms of the administrative state. This was the hub of Barack Obama's second inaugural address, in which he made it very clear that in 2012, actually it was January 2013, that we are now a collectivist state. And that in essence, the federal government would take it from here. He basically attempted to reconstruct the founding and the Declaration of Independence, saying that it was insufficient and that only a collectivist state would enable us to continue to go forward from here. In essence, that the first America was a fine experiment, but now what matters is the second America. And that second America is, sorry for repeating myself, is a collectivist nation of the administrative state. That's what we're up against. In essence, it is all of our structures of government, individual liberty, family, local school districts, local cities, townships, local counties, local states versus the federal administrative state. And what we lack is a Congress, even a minority, a significant minority in Congress, that is willing to look at this honestly and say, they are a part of a revolutionary pattern. That this is an attack of, in essence, the machines, okay, against the construct of human and civil liberty. The conditioners, C.S. Lewis called them the conditioners in that hideous strength. People who are a cultural elite who have amazing power delegated to them by Congress, who are now exercising that power against the principles of the founding, and a Congress that just lacks the courage to stand up and to convict those agencies of the true crimes that they are committing against the Constitution and the Declaration, and simply restricting them, taking away their funding, maybe even abolishing their existence. We don't have a Congress that's willing to do that on behalf of the people.
Thanks for stopping by at 1850 Main Street. We're glad you're here. Do you want to learn more about what is really going on behind the scenes in public policy? Tune in to The Public Square on over 200 radio stations coast to coast. Or download the free Public Square mobile app from your app store. Just look for The Lamppost. Find out what America is really talking about at thepublicsquare.com.
Let me ask you this question, because this is a term that's thrown around. I feel like we hear this often. Well, we hear it every 2 years when congressional races pop up and someone new wants to go to Washington, D.C., or maybe a Senate race, United States Senate race. Is a balanced budget possible with the expanse of government that we've talked about? Because, I mean, when someone puts that on their website when they're running for office, that attracts a lot of eyes and attention, does it not?
Sure.
But is that just a talking point? Is it possible?
Let's roll the clock back. And I'm willing to tell you that we were good friends with the former mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, a guy who had way too many vowels and syllables in his last name to be an effective politician. His name was George Voinovich. He was the mayor of the city of Cleveland. He was a county auditor. He held state positions. He was a legislator. He held public office in a number of different ways and served with a great amount of candor and honesty, and was really quite liked by the people. In fact, by the end of his career, George Voinovich became governor for 2 terms, and then went on to win and become a United States Senator for several terms. At the end of his career, he had actually received more votes on the ballot than anyone who had ever been a politician in the state of Ohio since 1803. This was a guy who had too many vowels and too many syllables in his last name. People grew to trust him. Well, when he ran for the United States Senate, he was a fiscal conservative. He was a fiscal hawk. And I know we spent a lot of time with George Voinovich, and Rob, you did too. You know that we worked with him quite a bit. And in fact, it was because of George Voinovich, it's going back 22 years ago this very month, that the first school choice case came forward with a program that Governor Voinovich commissioned and worked through the legislative process and through the state courts and then into the federal courts. Tremendous ally, a founding pillar. If it wasn't for the Cleveland Scholarship Plan, that your first school choice program to make it into the federal court structure, and eventually the case that would become the defining case on school choice, if it wasn't for George Voinovich, none of that would have happened. And that happened through a network of people who have been largely forgotten, because school choice now is in so many states, in so many places, and there's so many professional politicians hanging around the subject. But back when nobody but a handful of people cared about school choice, George Voinovich was one of the people who cared the most. And we were there. We witnessed it all. We saw it with our own eyes. So George Voinovich, when he ran for the Senate, one of his goals was a balanced budget. He was a fiscal hawk. And what he presented was that in his campaign that he would go up there to Washington, D.C. and fight for a balanced budget. So he gets elected. And he told me this story. He got elected, and when he got elected, he was brought up to the leadership of the Senate. This is the big house now. This is the Club of 100. These are the people who make all the decisions. And he was brought up to the Club of 100 and sat down with the leadership, and they said, "George, we're so glad to have you here. You are such an exemplary character. You've had such a brilliant career. We're delighted to have you in the United States Senate. And we want to work with you because we know you're a fair man and you can reach across the aisle," and so on and so forth. And George basically said, this is George. George told me this story. He said, and so I basically explained to them, my real reason for coming here is fiscal. I want to balance this budget. I want a balanced budget. And I want a balanced budget amendment. And they listened and they listened and they listened. And they turned back around and said, "George, we're really glad you're here. And we're really glad that was such an effective campaign issue for you. But let me explain something to you. That's never going to happen. And you really don't want to waste your time doing it or trying. We will never get the consensus it takes for that to happen in this Senate. It will never reach a point of overpassing the filibuster of 60 votes. You could spend your entire life here, and that is not going to happen. So what he said to me was, fiscal conservatives campaign on a balanced budget. When they get to Washington, they find out under the current regiment of the way the Senate's run, whether it's Democrat or Republican, it's never going to happen. So that's what we're up against. We're up against an administrative state that is fearless in resisting the will of the people. Now, that causes some people to say, well, then all that's left is a revolution against the government. Yes and no, depending on how you term the word revolution. What is possible is to understand how our system works and to flip it. The power of our government is only at the federal level if we don't activate all the power that is ours at the state and local level. But when people push back against the administrative state by electing genuine people who believe in the founding of our country, and I don't care whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, or Martians, if they're willing to stand for the founding principles of our country and to do the right thing, then the reality is the states can mobilize in resistance against the federal infrastructure and have a tremendous impact. And if those state officials that have the courage to do that in their own states and succeed, then run for the House and the Senate in our Congress, we can change this system. But we have to recognize if we don't, the revolution will come against the people, against the founding. It will prevail.
And it will take that revolution, but it's got to come from the people. And more people like George Voinovich need to go to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we've got to have people, and it's got to start in the states. It is not an impossible thing to do. I know it's stark to hear the analysis because it's not something you're going to see on Fox News or Newsmax or any of the conservative websites. They're going to tell you it's all about Donald Trump. Just vote for Donald Trump. Everything takes care of itself. That's not true. Donald Trump's elected. He'll be in office for 48 months, and 24 months, he'll be a lame duck. The change that we have to have is going to take 20 years. And it's going to have to take us embracing the reality that we've got to come back to the principles of the founding, and we've got to turn this system back right side up, which means from the bottom up, we have to find a way to overcome the administrative state. It's actually not as tough as you think. It's just, you've got to come to terms with the fact that you just can't let it keep happening, or the state's going to win.
Yeah, when you talk about 20 years, I mean, we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. But in the grand scheme of things, 20 years is not that long. It'll take work to get it done. But we live in a society today where we want instant gratification. Everything's at our fingertips. Get it done yesterday. We're not going to get it done yesterday. But if we keep working, there's a chance we can get it done tomorrow and the day after and the day after. But we got to stay with it.
Well, let's go back to one example that is bulletproof. It's real. We talked about the origins of the first school choice case. Now, school choice began in Milwaukee, in Florida, and Ohio. Those are the three communities where it really began to move forward. And any of those three communities, there could have been a federal case that rose up. It just so happened that it rose up out of Ohio. Why? Because a handful of people who believed in school choice at the bottom, no names who nobody knew, went to work, got people elected who believed in school choice, found a governor that would back it up, and they put together a law in 1997. The law was passed in the legislative process, and then everything began to fall into place. By the time we got to 2002, there was the matter had been litigated in 6 different courtrooms, the whole way to the United States Supreme Court, and the school choice case, rightly constructed in Ohio, won and broke open the possibility of states moving against the administrative state in the Department of Education and the attempt of a complete, total takeover of education. School choice is a positive alternative where people take personal responsibility and move the power back to parents, back to school buildings, back to teachers, back to school boards and to counties, and push the federal government out of the process. Now, that victory's been won, but it's been taking 20 years for people to suddenly realize, wow, just because you win a court case and some other states are doing it, it just doesn't magically happen. But it is happening, and it's happening in the states. And there are all forms of kinds of new forms. There's more homeschooling, more charter schools, more school choice schools. There's more things happening than ever before. It is a deconstruction in regards to education, one that nobody's talking about, but it's actually happening.
Yes.
You can fight the administrative state and win.
And it's a point where people are becoming even more educated on the issue, and they're able to talk about it in depth from their own experiences. So many times we just want to give the talking points or what we saw on cable news and argue with someone. When we dive deep, when we get the facts, when we understand the concepts and what's really happening and going on, and you can discuss the issue and let people know, hey, you know, I said this to someone the other day, and they aren't happy. Someone I was talking to isn't happy with school choice, and they were saying all kinds of things that weren't true. And I said, so you're telling me giving parents the option on where to educate their children is a bad thing? That's what you're saying? Well, and you see them backpedal. When you start asking questions and challenge the narrative that they've been presented and give them the facts, you can make a difference.
Well, the loneliest thing of all is to hear conversations like this and say, I guess I should be encouraged, but I feel like I'm completely, what can I do? What can I do? It's the right question. Keep listening. Stay with us at 1850. Visit with us at the public square. There is a growing community of people across this nation that could care less about the power of political parties. They're more interested in the principles of the founding and in personal and family liberty. They're interested in people being able to do the right thing the right way because we're Americans, not because we're identified as a tribe X, Y, or Z. There is a growing interest to do the right thing the right way. And after 45 years, we can attest to the fact that there's power in commitment, there's power in resistance, and it is possible to overcome evil by doing good. It really, truly is. So stay tuned, because you're not as alone as you may think.
The conversations are just getting started. To get connected, check out 1850mainstreet.com. We don't data mine anyone or sell your information. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.